An orchardist, Dwight Nash, come and share with us the tensions of living as a maverick multiplier.
I'm going to start with a pretty uncomfortable question, probably. Have you ever felt as if the Lord set you up to fail? I don't know if that's a heretical question or not, but it is a question I have struggled with in this church planting world. I would also like to follow that question up with a statement, and that is, if so, he probably has you right where he wanted you and right where he needs you to be. I'm going to take you back to a story you know very well from Scripture. Jesus is preaching to 5,000 men, perhaps 20,000 people. He's been preaching all day, all night long. The disciples become concerned because they know the people are getting hungry. And it's here, I'm kind of leaving a few points out, but it's here that Jesus says the most amazing thing possible to his disciples. You know what he said? He said, you plant a church. That's not what he said. He said, you give them something to eat. But I would suggest that those two statements are equally impossible. You plant a church, you give them something to eat. He commands us to do something that we can't do. Two equally impossible tasks. And so this miracle that you see of the feeding of the 5,000 really becomes a model for the disciples, and it becomes a model for us of what I believe we have to learn for the rest of our lives as spiritual leaders. But I really am speaking specifically to church planters today because you guys have my heart. Interestingly, while telling them to feed the 5,000, you move over to John chapter 6, and he says this, does this not make you angry? He asked this only to test them, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So let me get this straight. He commands us to do something that we can't do. See, I'm convinced in this world of church planting that he deliberately brings us to a place where we are powerless and where we simply cannot feed the 5,000, or in your case, plant a church. And I'm equally convinced that he does it deliberately. And for most of us, we have fought with tooth and nail to avoid that thought. I can do this. I'm capable. So why, here's the question I've been struggling with, why does he send us out to do things we can't do? Why does he send them out? Why does he send us out to force us to face our utter inadequacy? I call it the inadequacy wall. And if you've been a church planter, right? Ed, you were talking about, you have faced the inadequacy wall. He sends us out to make sure that we know how utterly incapable we are of doing what he called us to do. So let me hit pause for a second. If you're a church planter in the room, I wonder right now if perhaps you're struggling with this overwhelming requirement from the Lord, and you are scared, and you are up against this inadequacy wall, and you're struggling. And I'm convinced this is where we have to be as spiritual leaders. There's a principle that we have to learn, and it's the principle that Jesus was trying to teach his disciples that day, and it's the principle that we have to learn in our day. Here it is. You must do what you cannot do with what you do not have for the rest of your life. You haven't been in ministry very long if you haven't experienced that. Hey, go plant a church. With what? I don't have people and I don't have money, right? You must do, I'm going to say it again, you must do what you cannot do with what you do not have for the rest of your life. It's a paradigm miracle that he's sharing with the disciples that day. As a matter of fact, I'm convinced that Jesus will never give you an assignment that you can do on your own. He will only give you assignments that force you to radically and desperately depend on him. And so spiritual leaders, That's us in this room, right? You must learn this idea that you have to do what you cannot do with what you do not have for the rest of your life. Sometimes we think, like, man, I've graduated from that. Like, I'm on to bigger and better things. That just means the wall is higher. It just means the task is bigger. You're a leader. This is what you will do for the rest of your life. The point of this miracle that Jesus shares that day is the norm of serving Christ. It's the norm of planting churches. It's not the occasional. It's not the unusual. It's not because you're sinning. It's not because you've been disobedient. It actually is because you've been obedient. You are always going to be up against the wall of inadequacy, and it's never going to change. Welcome to ministry. Because Jesus is never going to give you something you can do. It's contrary to who Jesus is to give you something you can do. It's contrary to who he is. He can only give you supernatural responsibilities. And what he is giving us as the Wesleyan Church is a supernatural responsibility. And we stand up against a wall of inadequacy. But all he has to do is offer us supernatural responsibilities. That's who he is. That's what he does. That's the greatness, though, of being a leader for him, because we get to be called to do things that we can't do and that we could never do, but for some reason they come to pass through us. Welcome to church planting. Welcome to spiritual leadership for the rest of your life. And so right now, I would call you to more than ever take a deeper step of obedience and put your heart on the altar of God and saying, okay, Lord, I'm going to stop trying to prove I'm adequate for the task that you've given me. Here are my 5 loaves. Here are my 2 fish. They're in your hands. I put them in your hands. What do you want me to do now? I'll serve you. Again, you must do what you cannot do with what you do not have for the rest of your life. Now, there's an end to the story. That was not the end. We go back to the feeding of the 5,000. We're in Mark chapter 6, verse 41. They bring the 5 loaves, the 2 fish. They ask him, listen to this question. Is this not church planting? The most logical, rational question they could ever ask about this task. But what is this amongst so many? Have you been there? Okay, here's the task you gave me. Here's what I have. What is this amongst so many? Surely, as a planter, you've asked that once or 10,000 times. Yet what Jesus does is he directs them to break the group into 50s and have them sit down. And you know, the amazing thing about these disciples is they did what he told them to do. What they realized is they couldn't feed 5,000, and what we realize is that we can't plant a church, but we can be obedient. What he asks us to do, we can count to 50. Just do what he asks you to do. And so when Jesus prayed, it says he received the bread, he prayed, and then here's the reality. He takes what he can do, right? We bring these resources. They're never enough. We bring them. We put them into his hands. He breaks them. It doesn't say that then he delivered them. What did he do? He puts it back in the disciples' hands and says, now you go deliver this food. Do what I told you to do. You give them something to eat. I don't know when the miracle happened, and sometimes you don't either, right? But somewhere in the process of being obedient to what you can do, God shows up and does what he can do. And if you've ever done it, you feel so inadequate because all you had to bring to the process was 5 loaves and 2 fish. I hope this challenges you. I hope it invigorates you. I find it exciting. It stirs my heart that God can ask me and use me to do things that are so much bigger than I have the capability of doing. So here's what I would say to you. Don't run away from the opportunities just because they look huge. Don't say to him, I can't do this. Well, let me back that up. Tell him you can't do this because it's true, right? But instead, step into whatever it is he's calling you to do and say, all right, Lord, whatever you have, I'll take it from you. You must do what you cannot do with what you do not have. How long? For the rest of your life. And if you do, he will do what he can do with what little you have for the rest of your life. God bless you.
Thank you, Dwight. Well, it's my privilege to introduce my wife, Emily Love.